In the beginning, before there was a world or humans, there was only Raven and her friend Coyote.
This is the beginning of a Plains Indian story featuring a figure called Old Man Coyote, and it's a story that's existed since before recorded history. It's tough to trace the origins of these types of tales, since the Plains Indians didn't have a written text to mark down the tale word for word, so it shifts and changes and becomes something new to the new generation that interprets it. Most faiths today begin first by passing down traditions by mouth, rather than by writing it down, and if those oral stories become important enough, they'll officially be recorded and set in stone. These types of histories or moral lessons find their way from generation to generation for hundreds or thousands of years and become a part of the fabric of this community's identity. For religion, important ideas that are passed on form a canon, like the Bible, and are eventually written down either by the person who started them, like Paul's letters to the Corinthians or Romans, or by leaders who viewed those stories as formative to their time and circumstances, like the Book of Psalms. The Bible is a compilation of materials gathered and collected over several millennia. We'll get into this at a later point. And there's a lot of history to sift through. But of all these passages, stories, and Ancestry.com portfolios, which one is the oldest of them all? And why should it matter? First off, there are a few complications that might get in the way of a good answer. Based off of documented world history, we know that Israel, the people who would eventually become the Jewish culture and from which a segment would break off and form Christianity, didn't start writing anything down until about 1300 BC or BCE. They had that oral history we're referring to, but those were loosely told and ever-changing every time another person retold it. After that, passages started appearing that would find their way into the Bible we have today, specifically the Old Testament. Secondly, these books weren't written in the order they appear in the Bible. No, each book, and sometimes several parts of a single book, were written by different people in different places and at different times. The history described in the Bible uses metaphor, parable, and a pinch of history to cushion and explain their laws, which is the primary contents of what's known as the Torah, literally translated as the law. Today we like to think of history as clear-cut and easily accessible. We have textbooks, we have the internet, but for the ancient tribes of Canaan in the mid-13th century, history didn't matter because survival was more important. None of that matters if you don't exist anymore. It might be a little simple to say that these people didn't care about literal history, so they didn't keep very good track of their own origins, but these people didn't care about their history or keep very good track of it. Stories in the Bible that date themselves back before this time period, like creation stories and early civilization, aren't first-hand accounts printed in our Bibles, because those passages were just the latest version of stories as old as time that had already been through quite a few versions. So the takeaway here is that the Bible may be a powerful tool in our faith, but it's not a great history book. Luckily, there are other historical records we can turn to help us in our search. So after some archaeological sifting and cross-referencing, there's quickly a top candidate, a formation story, and setting the tone for the rest of the Bible. A tone of survival for people under constant threat of annihilations from the powers that be. Even if you weren't raised in church, the story of Moses, Pharaoh, and the Exodus from Egypt are pretty universally known. Moses frees people from Pharaoh and leads them out of Egypt. Did it happen like the story says? Unfortunately, there's no evidence as to the type of exodus that we read about in this book. Egyptian history never documented a revolt like this, and it would have been taking place before the Israelite community wrote anything down, since the Egyptian Empire lost power in about 1300, and we didn't get our first official tribal records for another 300 years or so later. So it's pretty unlikely that the movie The Ten Commandments would provide anything useful to our understanding of what actually went on here. There probably was a historical figure named Moses who helped some Canaanite slaves get away from Pharaoh and resettle in the hills. The heroic tale of this man who saved a few men would spread from village to village and become an inspiration for community's own survival against local pharaohs who raided and enslaved these small Canaanite tribes after the Egyptians left the region in about 1300. Out of this tale that grew to be the size of that fish you caught last summer, there are some nuggets of historical truth that reveal something very important about this community. That is, their history is one of survival. Granted, Yahweh did a lot of heavy lifting in this story. so we can often overlook the role that us mortals had to play. But if we just examine the good guys of this story, their actions speak volumes about the earliest Israelite values. We start the story with the midwives Sipra and Puah disobeying Pharaoh's command to kill all the male Israelite babies, claiming that Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They are so strong that they give birth before the midwives have a chance to get them, hence Moses is able to survive. Then, later, Moses tries to convince Pharaoh to let them have a 3-day festival outside of Egypt with the intent to, obviously, flee for good. Then, when Pharaoh tries to get them to have their festival back in Egypt, Moses responds by saying, well, the sacrifices would obviously be too distasteful for the Egyptians to have to watch, and ultimately misled Pharaoh by saying, well, of course they'd need their livestock and supplies to go on this short pilgrimage as well. Don't worry, we'll be back. We can overlook these common occurrences in favor for cooler themes like obedience to a mighty God or victory over oppressive forces, but it's undeniable that the role of trickster is amongst one of the earliest Israelite traditions to have made their way into the Bible. In fact, another origin story for Israel, the conflict between Jacob and Esau, is littered with ancient parables about tricksters being valued as the thing that could ensure that you survive. From Genesis 25 to 35, we see a never-ending parade of trickery. Jacob tricks his brother into selling his birthright for a hot meal. Rebecca, Jacob's mom, dresses Jacob up to trick his blind dad into giving him the better blessing. Jacob then flees and gets himself tricked into working for a man called Laban for a complicated marriage situation that doesn't really work out. And of course, Jacob uses magic to outwit Laban and run away with his new wife Rachel, who in turn steals and hides her dad's belongings under her when he comes looking. Now, it might have crossed your mind that stories about trickery and deception aren't exactly hot topics for the latest Sunday school lesson plan. That's probably one of the main reasons we don't really identify the trickster with Israel's history in Genesis or Exodus. But awareness to the history of this text gives us a new insight we didn't have before. Why would trickery be of value to anyone? History shows that the oldest tribes of Israel were suffering against a cruel superpower that took advantage of them, assaulted their families, kidnapped local leaders, and killed their soldiers. I was gonna originally say that this was the type of oppression we don't really appreciate in this day and age, but with recent events on the world stage, I think we can get a glimpse into what the daily reality of people like this were thousands of years ago, and the types of fear-filled situations that people still feel today. If you play by the rules set by those who mean to see your family tree gone, you will die. The trickster here takes on a meaning we need to separate from our modern stereotypes about trickery. There's an alternative to fight or flight that allows them to get by for just another day, one where they use their brains and wits to ensure their survival. So we're getting closer to answering the big question, but we're not quite there yet. Moses and Jacob's stories may be prehistoric themes, but the text that we read today was only written down several centuries later. Parables and ideas like Moses and Jacob survive, but there's also a possibility that we haven't looked at yet. Poems or songs. Throughout the Old Testament, songs and poems are significantly more likely to remain preserved from their oral traditions because, like songs and poems today, there are patterns and cadences that make it necessary to keep the same words and rhythm to make sense. You'd know if a song like this had any of their words changed.
Never gonna give you up, never gonna let you down.
Anyway, by closely examining the stories throughout the Old Testament, we're able to narrow down those passages that discuss the formation of Israel, include specific names or regions that can be cross-checked, and keep a short poetic structure. So after some extensive research, we're left with a great candidate in Judges 5, the Song of Deborah.
Ray!
Like that, that's like the angels are singing.
No, not that Deborah. Not only is this a poem that contains prehistoric references to the tribes of Israel, but the text also contains a form of archaic Hebrew that was phased out after only a short period of time. Add all these things together and we have our top contestant for the oldest passage. But what does the Song of Deborah tell us? The song opens with a hymn of praise describing Yahweh's triumphant appearance from the southern desert regions of Seir and Edom. Yahweh is envisioned as a powerful storm god present throughout the song, but there's also an equally important focus on the people. Out of a disorganized group of nomadic tribes, a leader rises up. Her name was Deborah. She called the tribes of Israel together and went into battle. Interestingly, only 6 tribes came to her call. 4 chose to stay out of the war and mind their own business, and 2, Judah and Simeon, weren't even mentioned. Even with the defected tribes, Deborah still encourages them to see themselves as sharing a common destiny under Yahweh. The rest of this chapter goes on to describe the battle and its aftermath. Jael, who was a part of Israel's victory, is blessed for tricking Sarah into enjoying her hospitality and then killing him with a mallet. Yes, there we go again. But this entire chapter in the book of Judges focuses on a very important point, evident in the earliest text of Judaism and one that's built upon over the course of the next several thousand years. Survival is hard. Sometimes it takes trickery, cunning, or smacking someone's head in with a mallet. But for the people telling and eventually writing these stories down, the value of resourcefulness and determination fill in that backstory behind the commonly celebrated deception that we often overlook. The point of taking into account this type of history with holy text isn't meant to say, this is the way you should interpret. It's to offer a different window to look through, the possibility of reading tough or confusing biblical stories. Like the Plains Indian Coyote, these stories, and the reasons behind them, will survive regardless. Since the waters were first formed, God has been showing us through miracles and mundane life alike that we're called to rise up and survive, persevere, and share the tale for the next generation of children whose tests have yet to be formed. So, until our paths cross again, may the peace of a God that surpasses all understanding be with you.